Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and we're back with another edition of starter builds for a new league. This time around, it is the expansion for Siege of the Atlas and the Archnemesis League. I've got just a few little pretty basic builds cooked up that should get you going in the game. They are once again starter builds, so they're nothing too crazy, and they shouldn't require much, and they don't really max out at the highest level, but they should be smooth enough to start playing and progressing through the game with the new content. And given that there's been some pretty large buffs to self-casting and bows, I've tried to incorporate at least one of each of those, though still typically some good self-casting action isn't really the strongest way to start a league out, as just mechanically it's not quite as strong as some things like damage over time. Either way, we're doing our best to incorporate a few of those builds, and a couple of these builds can even actually go very high, but I've done my best to keep it pretty humble and pick things that should play well enough from level 1 up to about level 70 without really any investment. And this is actually the first time I've ever really done some trial runs of some builds since we had enough time to actually test some things out. And most of my characters that I trial around got up to about level 60 and were wearing just about white gear across the board with just a few 3 or 4 links, and it seems to work out pretty well. So I hope these starters aren't a bit too hipster and just give you some viable alternatives to a lot of the meta shit you may have seen on other people's streams. Since the meta itself hasn't really been shaken up too much, it's just some things got buffed, whereas things that used to work still work pretty well throughout the entire of Scourge League. Most things that worked haven't really received many nerfs, and you can typically just go back and look at plenty of old builds throughout Scourge and jump into one of those if you are stuck for ideas. And so the first build to have a look at is Wintertide brand Occultist. Now it isn't purely Wintertide brand. This type of playstyle and archetype, cold damage over time, basically incorporates several cold damage over time skills, but the one that we're mostly utilizing for our clear is Wintertide brand. That's what you see on the screen, these little bouncing sort of explosions. It's a brand skill, which means you put down this sort of marker that attaches to enemies, and it pulses for a few seconds, and then it goes back down on the ground if the enemy's dead, and it can pulse onto another enemy. Or you can spec into certain things that make the brand itself bounce between enemies, and in this case it stacks up a cold damage over time debuff. This is the character I played for the Gauntlet event, which has extremely modified versions of the game's mechanics and bosses, where there's much more life, much more damage, attack speed, everything, and it served me really well. So it was a completely solo self-found and hardcore character and environment, and you can build this type of character as thick or as thin as you want, focusing more on DPS or more on survivability. And for this version of the starter, I have taken some of the defense out just to take a bit more damage and not really need to be gauntlet viable. But it's a very strong build to start out with. It's been established for quite a while, I think, the cold damage over time sort of archetype. It's my first time I've played it in years, and it seems like it's kind of a just smooth play style of get a few dots up and then run around and just focus on living. So let's see what the character looks like. So the Wintertide brand Occultist, like I mentioned, is a little bit more right side heavy compared to the Gauntlet version I played, which didn't take any of this side of the tree and stuck entirely to this side because it got a bit more life and block and stuff. The most important part about Wintertide brand when you first start out is getting all the way over to Runebinder, so you can have an additional brand attached to the enemy, and especially getting through to Runesmith, so that you can then take brand mastery of the one that chains brand attached to a new enemy each time they activate, no more than once every 0.3 seconds. As soon as you get this one, it starts to bounce your brand in a pack of enemies between the mobs, and then it really starts to take off on clear right around level 12 to 15, whenever the fuck you get it. So you start the character off just with like freeze pulse, something like that. Pretty basic stuff, just freeze pulse, grab a holy flame totem, use a flame wall, something like that. Once you get to level 12 and you can get Wintertide brand, you pop that on, you are hopefully almost at this place and you can get the mastery, and then basically you incorporate couple extra supports like efficacy, and hopefully you are damn near close to getting Cold Snap and Vortex, which are going to be your assists in damage, as well as the Wintertide brand itself. So Wintertide brand is when you're running around basically right-clicking and clearing from a distance, but you will have your Vortex on your left click, and that's just going to be constantly popping off just at your feet, and that helps do quite a lot of damage. And then you'll be using Cold Snap every now and again whenever you feel like you need to, for a bit of extra DPS and also more range damage over time. And as well as that, I've got it incorporated with Hex Touch, which is a curse on hit for either Ellie Weakness or Frostbite, whichever one you don't have on a ring, because the ideal ring in the end has probably a Frostbite, so that you're frostbiting with all of your hits, and then you're getting Ellie Weakness in the build as well. So the Wintertide brand early links are going to be Wintertide brand, efficacy, and then control destruction. Then you'll probably incorporate something else like inspiration, hypothermia. You can also do swift affliction, but be careful, because if you do that, you might reduce the duration of the brand itself to not stack up to 20 stacks well enough, because it does need 20 stacks to get to its max amount of damage, and each enemy can have up to 3 brands attached to it. So Wintertide brand doesn't have huge numbers or anything, but Vortex then helps quite a lot as well. As you can see, deals quite a bit of damage, and then the Cold Snap itself does a lot as well. So in total, we're dealing like 1 to 1.5 million damage off of a pretty basic setup. And I'd say, yeah, you basically go out this way. Then you can take whatever else you'd want. If it was me, I'd probably go this way, grab these nodes down here, and then start going up for a bit more damage over time and shit, so that you can start ramping, at least on softcore, some good clear speed and damage. And I think getting a bit of cast speed into the build is somewhat important, just so that your brand stacks up faster and your playstyle is a bit smoother. We're going for cold damage over time, bit of cast speed, using a Rhyme Gaze for our Vortex, and then pretty basic gear, whatever you want. This is some of this stuff is still from my solo self-found hardcore character, and this damage over time you're going to see a couple times throughout the video. It's from the essence of Delirium. Well, yeah, the Delirium essence, sorry. And you just apply it to rings for that damage over time. Other than that, Determination, you can run Malevolence, you can get more thick, you can get thinner if you want. Up to you guys if you want to build more into block and stuff like that. I've just picked up Glancing Blows, got some Determination, bit of armor, nothing too serious. But you can reference my videos on Wintertide brand throughout the Gauntlet event if you'd rather, for a bit more in-depth talk about the skill and the playstyle. The next build I'll fire off at you is a bit provisional and trying to lean into the self-cast buffs and hopefully meta, and it's probably not going to be for the faint of heart, because leveling self-cast is a little bit tough, especially if we're doing some somewhat out there choices, and this one is Ice Spear and then a bit of Eye of Winter for clear as well. Ice Spear is the end game goal of this build, but early on you're not really going to have all of the tools for Ice Spear to just carry a build on its own, so we do also use Eye of Winter with a chain to help assist on the clear. And I think this is one that should end up having quite a high ceiling, but it's going to be pretty clumsy early on, and I'm hoping to make this one a Deadeye, but Occultist is also a very safe option. And I did test this build up to about level 60 on standard with no gear whatsoever, and it still works pretty well, and it's going to be buffed by a substantial margin with the new buffs, but it is a very sort of active dodging and positioning style playstyle, so it's going to be a bit weird if you're not used to that. And it's going to take a bit of ramping until we get the appropriate things like additional projectiles, the right crit, the right cast speed, some pierce or some chain, and as you can see, it will be freezing bosses, and the playstyle is going to be largely about just positioning and getting yourself into the best perfect situation against a boss. And the new buffs should also increase our single target on Ice Spear, since the spread of the projectiles won't be quite as bad on the single target. So we'll have to wait and see for that one, but this is one I'm probably going to be testing myself manually and hopefully seeing some good results. I've made up two Path of buildings, basically the same thing, but one from an Occultist point of view, which is over here, and one from a Deadeye point of view. I think the Occultist is going to be overall a much safer choice. It's just going to have a better start by far, and also kind of a safer playstyle with the amount of damage reduction you're going to get at the same time as getting a bunch of damage. But I'm personally more interested in a Deadeye version and going to start that out, I think. It's got a bit of a slower start because you will be taking these early projectile nodes, so start by going through these instead of these. This is eventually something you do in the end, just to save some points. And there's not too much more you get beyond that for a while, so we'll have to like go up and take some int, which is going to be tough for this build. May even actually just level it as bows or helix or something like that until around level 30ish, when you can even pick up the spells, because you won't get these spells early on till library. I wouldn't really recommend following this if you're kind of more looking for an easy starter. Instead, if you still like the self-cast idea, go with the Occultist, because it does have an actual proper start. You grab Freeze Pulse or Frostbolt or whatever skill you want, grab a Holy Flame Totem, grab a Flame Wall, and then by level 12 you get Ice Spear. Make sure you have Pierce attached to your Ice Spear early on, because it's pretty bad without it. You can also incorporate like Ice Nova into this sort of a start if you'd rather. And then at level 28 we get Eye of Winter, and that's when we start trying to hopefully incorporate the duo playstyle of Eye of Winter and Ice Spear and pure self-cast action. Whereas I think I'm going to try Deadeye, and I think it's going to be a bit of a weird start, especially since we don't have much int or spells early on, and we'll see how we manage that. But by around level 40, should be well and truly ramped. So get the additional chain. My next ascendancy will be the 2 additional proj, and then hopefully incorporating some sniper mark action on single targets. It will make some crazy shenanigans. I'd say the biggest problem I have while trying to make these is trying to figure out some cast speed, and as well as that, the mana. So I think we are going to be somewhat reliant on Mana Flask, and this is going to be a very build it as I go type of build. I've still got to cut a few points as well, because it's a very high level passive tree. So this is one that you can kind of follow along as I play it, I think, because it's going to probably change as it happens. But currently I'm just trying to get some cast speed and trying to cap spell suppress, get a bit of extra energy shield for just ghost shrouding and defenses. I'm going for a series step. Pandemonious hopefully is accessible enough early on, and then Snake Pit. If it's not accessible, then the Occultist version is going to be reliant much more on Eye of Winter with Chain for its clear, whereas I think it's going to be just a luxury for the Deadeye. We'll have to wait and see. And the Occultist side of things, we are going, personally I went for the 20 cold res and then the extra cold damage early on. You can then get an additional curse in this build with Frostbite, whereas the Deadeye version is just going to have Sniper Mark, and you can also have explosions in this version as Profane Bloom. Once again, going to have to cut a few points somewhere, and in this case it might end up just being maybe recoup isn't worth it, because this is going to be a very preventative damage playstyle. So, you know, you freeze things, you avoid things, and you do have some damage reduction coming in from Frigid Wake and from Malediction. Otherwise, it's a bit of a provisional one. Do this one if you are feeling a bit dicey, a bit risky, and seeing if you want to do some self-cast with Eye of Winter and Ice Spear. The next build is one that is going to be relying a bit more on the bow buffs for this patch, and the main bulk of the bow buffs is basically just to the base types of the bows themselves. So damn near 50% increase on the base of a good bleed bow means that bleed Gladiator is going to be a pretty respectable build this league, I think, at least for a start. Looks like it gets up to about 1 million DPS off of fairly regular gear, and the playstyle is pretty damn nice with the Gladiator bleed pops. So you run around, you apply a bleed, and then an entire pack just explodes thanks to the ascendancy that you get during Cruel Lab, your second ascendancy. And it's honestly a bit of a slow start until you get that. You'll start out with Split Arrow, you'll use Puncture, and just try and ramp your bleed as much as possible. But until you get those pops, it doesn't really truly take off. Puncture will of course do good single target damage up until you get that point, but that is the main draw of the build, and I think it's a pretty basic starter but a reliable and solid one, and should do some pretty good things in the end. I think it's a fairly zoomy play style. Once you're up and running, it just starts out fairly slow, so don't be too discouraged unless you're hitting around level 60 and still not having fun. It does just start out a bit slow, and eventually it gets to the point where you are completely zooming, clearing maps real quick, and your bleed damage is fairly respectable. And then your main big ticket item that you're going to be upgrading throughout the duration of the character is seeing if you can get bigger and better bows and influenced ones. So the rest of the gear, not really too much you can do, and you can ultimately revise your passive tree to incorporate cluster jewels, but the base passive tree doesn't go for any of that, just a bunch of life, good bit of armor, well, some armor, and then all the bleed stuff and physical damage stuff on the entire tree. So it's nothing too revolutionary for a build idea, but got to incorporate something bow-wise. You could of course do some hit-based bow stuff like a lightning arrow, but that will flounder on single target until you have the right gear for it. The passive tree, I haven't spent too long looking at it, so maybe there's various things you can do better with it. It goes a bit all over the place, and you do get about 1 million puncture DPS, which is fairly respectable, I think. You got a couple of choices to begin with. You can either go to the right and start getting some damage and the phasing skills that are going to be over here, or you can go straight to the left and start getting the bleed. And I think I went to the left first, because otherwise it's really hard to get your chance to bleed up. So your first few points, at least the way I did it, was go this way and then straight over here, and then start taking these chance to bleed nodes, and then this node over here for extra damage. And that's because your split arrow with chance to bleed attached is only going to have 25% chance to bleed until you pick up some other shit like this, and ultimately get your first ascendancy point, which gives you a lot of extra chance to bleed. It's at that point that you can start to like kind of respec these, and if you get some bleed on your bow, that's good too. But you definitely want to start getting some damage early on too. So then at that point, after I grabbed that, is when I went down here, picked up this damage, and then you can decide whether you want to go this way and pick up your damage, or go that way and start getting closer to resolute techniques, because you will start to go lower and lower in accuracy as you level up. So you're going to use a precision precision aura until you get this for hits can't be evaded. So keep an eye on your hit chance until you get to this, because the lower your hit chance goes, it starts to feel substantially worse. Don't let it slip below like 95%. But it's a pretty easy sort of start. Just get some bleed damage, some bleed chance on your split arrow. So your split arrow will be what you use to clear, and it will have... Shit, do I have another split arrow? Should have. Split arrow will be attached to chance to bleed and whatever else you can at that point, probably maim, deadly ailments, cruelty, but you don't need too many things. Pierce as well. So Pierce is what I had. Pierce, split arrow, and chance to bleed is what we used for clear, and you may need a mule a Pierce from just Ranger, killing Hillock real quick. And then once you get puncture at like level 4, you attach chance to bleed to it. Not much you can do early on, and then ramp it once you start getting to deadly ailments, vicious proj. That'll probably be like your 3-link there, or your 4-link if you can get the whole thing for deadly ailments, chance to bleed. And that's when things start to kind of take off. Once you get that 4-link, make sure you pick up an ensnaring arrow as soon as you can. I think that's at level 16, and that's when that's what makes enemies take damage as if they were moving, and that's when your puncture starts to actually do a bit of good single target. Make sure you try and upgrade your bow as often as possible, so like every 5-10 levels, you know, throw an essence on it, something like that, get higher physical damage. The main thing that really matters is your physical damage. This bow here is looking pretty big, but it's going to be a pretty basic bow with the bow buffs, since Citadel bows get like 50% more flat fizz, something like that. So essentially all you really need is just a big percent fizz roll onto it, and then craft a fizz, and that's going to be your basic bow. But if you can get attack speed, if you can get damage over time, it starts to feel a bit more quality of life. And your end game is going to be an Elder Bow, I believe, with a really big damage over time mod on that as well. I've also incorporated a Salem, so that might be your end game for the build. Currently, just go for no Salem, don't do anything like that. But if it's available and you want to try out the playstyle, you get an Asylum into the build, and then you'll have Puncture in your 4-link Asylum, and that's when you start trying to incorporate this sort of really channeling playstyle that unleashes one big Puncture and hopefully increases your single target by a decent amount. As you can see, it goes up to like 2.5 million bleed, changing nothing in the build, but it just turns your Puncture and your single target into a wind-up and a bit of a different playstyle. It is difficult to get off on certain encounters and bosses, so beware of that. But the base version does not include any Asylums. Try that out if you want to get to it and if it seems available enough. And then the final build I wanted to share is one that's fairly new to me, and I was just testing it out for the first time as a starter, and that is Wave of Conviction Ignite. Ignite is a very solid starting sort of setup and build for kind of whatever you want to choose to do with it, but in this case we've chosen to do Wave of Conviction, and it's very solid just because it's extremely reliable damage and has very nice clear through Ignite Proliferation. So the main source of this build is basically just casting a Wave of Conviction, that's the big blue flame, and then it proliferates all of its Ignite, and it doesn't take much gear to get going. It does have somewhat of a ceiling unless you really start to invest hard, but that's when you also start to incorporate other additional tools to help your Ignite out, and that will be in the form of Flame Wall, Flame Surge, and Fire Trap. Now both Flame Surge and Fire Trap leave a burning ground, so I don't think they stack, but they kind of serve different purposes at different times anyway. So for the most part you're just Wave of Convictioning, but once you get to single target and bosses you're going to be using a Wave of Conviction. You'll throw down a Flame Trap, Fire Trap, sorry, or you'll use your Flame Surge, and you'll also hopefully use a little bit of Flame Wall for additional DPS. But all in all, builds should have something like 1 to 2 million DPS, and the Ignite from the Wave of Conviction itself should carry fairly hard, but it's kind of an amalgamation of plenty of different things to incorporate several skills. And it is an Elementalist, and it really doesn't do too much until you get Wave of Conviction at level 16, but even then the build actually starts to be kind of Ignite based and takes off once you get the first Ascendancy for Elementalist, the big Ignite one, and that's when all of your damage from Wave of Conviction starts to ignite, and that's when it starts to actually do some real Ignite damage. Until then you will probably be using quite heavily Flame Wall and Holy Fire Totem, and as well as that you can start out with some Fireball action, and in general the entire build can just be played as Fireball if you would rather that playstyle. But let's have a look at how the build looks. So it should be somewhat of a humble setup, but it is a little janky to get started for the first 20-30 levels. Like I said, Fireball will help you out in that regard, but we grab a Freeze Pulse early on, or Freeze Pulse, Fireball, Purifying Flame, any of those. Helps you with a Holy Flame Totem and a Flame Wall. At level 16 I grabbed Wave of Conviction, though I don't think you're going to be doing much Ignite damage until level 30-ish, when you get the first actual Ascendancy point, which is Shaper of Flames, and that does a whole bunch of damage. Up until then, use Combustion attached to whatever you want to use, Flame, Fireball, or Wave of Conviction, but you don't necessarily have to be Ignite until you really get this. At that point, that's when you can start doing proper Ignite damage. That's when you attach some real supports to your Ignite. So we've got Wave of Conviction, you want Ignite Prolif at level 38. You can use just Elemental Prolif Gem until then. Added Fire, Burning Damage, Deadly Ailments, Unbound Ailments. I haven't included the sixth link here, and the sixth link could be some other things depending if you got the dexterity for it and all that, like Swift Affliction, but this is just what I've added for now, and it's on a 5 link. Your Flame Wall do a bit of extra damage, so 300k almost. Your Flame Surge, your Fire Trap does plenty of extra ground dot, and it's a bit of a, fairly active playstyle in the end. It's trying to be somewhat of a humble sort of start, just +1s and a bit of damage over times. Criminals is nice just so you can not be chilled or frozen. Ungul's Harmony, get that as soon as you can, because that's when you can start reliably upkeeping Elemental Overload. You still should take it early on because it's up a decent amount of the time, but once you get that amulet, that's when it keeps up pretty much always. But the start for the tree is essentially go through here. I'd encourage probably going through these nodes just early on and then unspecking them later, because it's not very important later, and spell damage doesn't scale the build. But you grab some of these, you then go over and you go straight into the damage over time and the chance to ignite, because and if you're going to try and build ignite early on, because you don't have much chance to ignite until you get the actual ascendancy. So you use combustion, grab these ignite nodes, and then as well as that, you can grab a Fire Mastery in the form of either, there's a lot of them, so they're all really quite good. If you're using Wave of Conviction early on, probably convert some of your Fizz into Fire, and then unspec that later, because you won't need it anymore later. But kind of builds itself beyond that point. You can kind of choose whichever masteries you want as you want, but there's lots of really good Fire ones. And then build a bunch of life and get some good defense. We got a good amount of armor through determination. Should be a very, very solid starter. Honestly, if I wanted a win out of all of my starters, I'd probably go with this. It tapers off on the high end unless you really start sinking plenty of currency in, but it's a very reliable and smooth playstyle. And just has a slowish start up until around 30, and then it really takes off, and from 30 onwards you probably won't hit any walls until like high red maps, some shit like that. I've also got one of the community members, Demon, from my chat, who actually has played this build in the past and has made a very thick version last league. It is somewhat scourgified, so actually it was. He's just made a very basic Searing Touch here. But it's a pretty expensive high-end version of the build, but you can see how powerful it can end up being. So it can go from like 3 to 5 million just pure Wave of Conviction DPS. And then if you incorporate similar to the way he has, you can have all kinds of armor and all resist through Brass Dome and just thickness. So I'll also give you that version if you want something to aspire to, but bear in mind this thing is expensive, whereas this should be a very nice, basically free level starter. And I think Wave of Conviction and Ignite is a very fun playstyle at the moment, or just any Ignite in general through Elementalist can get you going. So we start with this, then we go here and there. And our last 2 points I feel are very optional. You can take Shock, you can take more golems and get a few extra golems. You can take the Chill if you really want to slow everything down, or you can take the extra defense through the extra Primal Aegis. So up to you on that one, but that's kind of the build. Those are the starters. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you're looking forward to the new league. Don't expect much from the cosplay. I'll try and do something, but who cares? It's all about the new expansion, the new end game, and the new Atlas passives. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.